I appreciate each and every one of you that's here to support this good work. Lawrence and Randolph County Lectureships and the brethren that are here in these counties, you're doing a great work, and I just want to commend all of you. I appreciate Seth being upbeat. My topic is death, so I need all the help I can get. I haven't worn the black. I thought I have to wear my funeral suit. I'm preaching on death. We're going to talk about a topic that I guess at its best is just avoided. At its worst, it becomes an incentive or a license for people in the world just to kind of, as one writer said, to party on more furiously. But we're going to talk about this subject of death. This may be, hopefully, one of the few lessons you hear on a topic like this. It's not really something that we get up in the morning and we say, I'm going to write a lesson this week and I want to just talk about death for a half hour. It is something that we deal with. It's something that perhaps we've talked about. I was actually encouraged a few weeks ago, a congregation that I was affiliated with, they did a class. And let me just share this with you. It was kind of interesting. At first I heard it and I thought someone was joking. But they had a class, and those who attended the class, they were planning their own funeral. Can you imagine that? And I thought, wow, don't get preachers there. It would take hours for us to plan ours. You know, I thought about that on the negative side. If you've ever read through 1 Samuel chapter 15, there's a little note, I believe in verse 12, that it picks up that Saul had disobeyed God, but on his way back to meet with Samuel, have you ever caught that? That he stopped and built a statue for himself. And perhaps with most of us, when we think about life and death, we're thinking about what can we accomplish? What can we get or amass? And the brethren that have spoke prior to me have covered all of those subjects very well. I appreciate their study time and their work that they put into their lessons. I ran across a little story, and perhaps it'll help us out. Any of you familiar with a man by the name of Melvin Jerome Blanc? Well, his given name was actually Melvin Jerome Blank, born in May 30th, 1908. While he was in high school, he changed his last name, from Blank to Blanc. The reason being is he had a high school teacher that told him that with the last name of Blank, he wouldn't amount to much, so he changed his name. We are probably not familiar with his name, but his work. He provided us with the voices of Porky Pig, Daffy Duck, Bugs Bunny, and the list goes on and on. What is interesting, though, is that after these works, just prior to his death in 1989, he made his request. And on his headstone, if you remember the voices that I've mentioned to you, they were instructed, and these are the words that are scrolled out on his headstone. That's all, folks. Now, with us, many times when we talk about death, that's where our thoughts go. And Solomon is going to give us some instruction. He's going to talk about this subject. And Solomon kind of falls out of the usual of teaching. The amount of passages that deal with death is disproportionate to the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. Solomon actually speaks about death. Let's see, we have 12 chapters. He doesn't bring it up in chapter 1 or chapter 10, but every other chapter in the book there is some reference to death. Now this was somewhat out of the ordinary. If you read through his other writings, such as Proverbs, it speaks about if one is righteous and one is obeying God, then they're going to, in essence, as we would say, live forever and have everything they need. So in Ecclesiastes, what we're going to find is that Solomon is going to give us some instruction, kind of the instruction that we all need. That yes, indeed, I agree with all of our speakers up to this point. Life is tough. And what we have to do is blend together some thoughts. And let me share with you these thoughts. I've had the opportunity in the past to actually teach this book of Ecclesiastes, and it seems that there are some times that we run through this book and we make these assumptions that somehow we're kind of following Solomon, kind of a still photo in each chapter, that Solomon got up one morning and he said, hey, I'm going to go try pleasure. Hey, I'm going to go try wealth. But what we're looking at is Kohelet, the preacher that of Solomon, is inviting us on his journey. Solomon didn't just start out and say, let's try this and let's try that, but he's giving us an overview from what he's observing as he introduces these topics and invites each one of us to walk with him. As he goes through this journey, what we're going to try and do is tie together several passages. But I don't want you to think that the book of Ecclesiastes is like your Amazon account, and you're going to just keep putting things in a cart, and then you can decide later whether you want to purchase them or not. Some of the topics he's covered: wisdom, pleasure, work, wealth, status, relationships. Here's a side note. I oftentimes find myself with a little bit of laugh that we consider Solomon the wisest man to ever lived. And here's why I doubt that. He had 300 wives and 700 concubines, or as a little boy in Arkansas one time said, 300 wives and 700 combines. That made more sense to him. But then again, Solomon is giving us the reflections from his own journey, and he's helping us because of the topic that I've been assigned, death. Because once we get to that point, I don't want to share this or break this bad news to you, but once death comes upon us, it's over. Our opportunities to obey the gospel, to live a faithful, productive life for God, they end. It's not as if we can say, oh, well, we'll get this second chance. When death comes, it's over. So Solomon is actually going to give us some help, some instruction. Let me share with you a thought. In Ecclesiastes 12 in verse 1, Solomon shares these thoughts with us, and he tells us to remember our Creator in the days of thy youth. Now, usually this is kind of the passage that when we're scheduling something for our young people, this goes on the postcard, right? Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Do you know why Solomon is saying that? He's saying do it while you're alive, while you still have chance or opportunity to make a change. He's not saying use this as your banner at the next teen get-together, but he's reminding us, make the changes now. Solomon really ruined his life, falling away from God, and many look at this book of Ecclesiastes as his letter of repentance. He's coming back and he's saying, here's everything I did wrong, kids. Don't follow me. But as we look at this incredible book, I'm going to share a few things with you. Some things that as we take a look at them and we bring them out, they're going to challenge us. They're going to cause us to kind of look at these things and say, what are we doing? I'm going to introduce a few phrases to you. I'm going to try and help us out as we go through this. And here is the one phrase I want to share with you. In much of the readings and research, we started a few years ago, maybe as far as back as a decade, and we started hearing this term of worldview. And we thought, well, it's a globe, we can see it. But with this worldview, Solomon is going to challenge our worldview. But he's going to challenge us with this worldview by starting at the end, at that of death. Here's the final, here's the exam you've all been waiting for, and then he's going to back us up and look at all of the choices that we make. Now, as we talk about a worldview, I know, big fancy terms. These are what I call Scrabble words. They're great if you're playing Scrabble, lots of bonus points, but if we don't understand them, they don't serve us any purpose. Our worldview can be defined as that grid by which we view the world. Most of us, our worldview was already established by the time we hit kindergarten, meaning that we learned it at home around our parents. It is why the home and the family is so very important. The reason why many of us are in these seats today is because of the establishment of a belief in God and God's Word and how we should conduct ourselves was established for us by watching parents, by watching family, by watching friends. It can also go to the opposite side where we find there are examples we don't want to repeat or we don't want to follow. But Solomon is going to challenge our worldview, and he is going to take us through this journey with him to help us to understand what we have to do. Now, as we all understand, we're all tempted with many things. When it comes to the topics that we'll discuss today, we're going to find that there is a mixture within the book. And here's another big phrase for you. All of you have probably heard that phrase of carpe diem, or to seize the day. The book of Ecclesiastes is full of those passages. What I would like to do is we're going to just select a couple and tie some things together. As you're going through these, what we're going to note is, pardon me here, I love to carry a lot of papers with me. My daughters actually, they said one time, "Dad, why do you do that?" And I said, really, it's to intimidate the audience. What I do is I like to grab like a big sack of books and drag them up here, and you throw them down, and then the audience goes, "Do we have to wait for all of that?" No, we don't. Let me give you a few things to think about. Chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes. This sets the tone for the whole book. Solomon is going to begin there in verse 2 of chapter 1, and he proclaims, "Vanity of vanity," says the preacher, "vanity of vanity, all is vanity." Another way to translate that word vanity is meaningless. And notice when he starts in verse 3. "What profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away, and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. The sun also rises, and the sun goes down, and hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes towards the south and turns around to the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers come, there they return again." Solomon is speaking about the endless cycles of life. And he's saying that when we talk about the waters, rain comes and swells the rivers run into the ocean, then the whole cycle begins again. And he's saying they're no better off. And he compares life to that there are times in our life where we say we're doing all of this, but it seems to have no meaning. We just kind of get up. I'm glad every morning when I get up, the sun's up. That lets me know I'm still alive. And then at night, it's going to go down. And then the next day, we do it again. And Solomon says you get caught up in all of these cycles, and pretty soon you're just kind of going through things, and it didn't result in anything. But let's put some of these other passages together. Go over to chapter 3 and verse 13. What we're going to see here is he's going to give us one of those carpe diems, that of really just seize the day and enjoy it. Here in chapter 3, verse 13, he says, "And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God." First and foremost, there is absolutely nothing wrong with Christians, first of all, smiling and laughing and having a good time. I think we're entitled to that because we're surrounded by the best people, we're living the best life, and we're going to the greatest place. So please smile. Yeah. One thing that's always a discouragement to me is you meet good, faithful brothers and sisters in Christ, and they give the appearance as if they were weaned by a dill pickle. Smile, people. We're alive today. So, Solomon tells us about these passages to eat, drink, and enjoy. He says it's the gift of God. Now continue on. We're going to go over to chapter 5. Again, I'm not covering everything in the book. Why? Because you all have your own copy and you can read at home in your leisure. But here's a few passages. Chapter 5, verse 19. Again, he said, "As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and to rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God." Okay, we can go through each one of these different passages, and I believe there are 7 different ones. Going throughout the book, just reminding us, here is kind of what you have to eat, to drink, meaning God has provided food. You have those things of the basic substance of life. Solomon says to enjoy them. He adds parts to them. But now look at chapter 7 and verse 2. This is where that dramatic music would come in, that dun-dun-dun, because while you're eating and drinking and enjoying life, and here, we'll back up in chapter 7, because this is a point that just occurred to me the other day when I was reading verse 1. "A good name is better than precious ointment, in the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart." Solomon here says, notice the other 2 passages, eat, drink, enjoy life. And then here in chapter 7 he says, because we're all going to die. I don't have any other pretty way to put that. But that's what he's doing. He's bringing us to that. But here, notice this, in chapter 7, verse 1. We have read this, we have preached on it, we have quoted this. A good name is better than precious ointment. Do you realize that you have to die in order to secure a good name? Because while you're still living, you can mess it up. Do you ever think about that? While we are still alive, we can mess it up and ruin a good name. So Solomon says, he's pointing us towards death. And he's saying, death is for all. Now, there is a generation that will not have to die to get out of this life. That generation will be the generation that is still living when Christ comes again. Unfortunately for all of us, we don't know when Christ is coming again, so guess what? We are all going to die. Like Genesis chapter 5. You read through all those great and wonderful men. And he died, finishes out the verse. Next section, and he died, and he died. You get the point? We're going to die. And instead of us sitting around, don't talk about that. Oh, we can't bring that up. We have to know the reality that, yes, God has given us wonderful things. We have the abilities. I believe Solomon reminds us that our ability to work, our ability to have food is a gift from God, and we are to enjoy it, but that cannot be all. That cannot be the total substance. As you look at these verses, we've tied them together. Chapter 3, we talked about eat and drink and enjoy your life. Chapter 5, eat, drink, and enjoy your life. Chapter 7, here's where everything changes. Life is not just about, well, I'm enjoying everything. You know, there's some times where I just become very puzzled, and I'm not sure why, but when you look around, you wonder about the people who don't want to hear the gospel. They don't want to sit down for a Bible study. Somehow they're going to live wrong and they're going to keep doing it, and somehow it's just an incentive for them to do exactly opposite of what God wants. But Solomon is reminding all that are in his audience, as he is described as Koheleth, the preacher, the assembler. He's bringing together a group of people to teach them, and he reminds them, hey, guess what? You can enjoy your life, but your life is going to come to a close. Now, earlier I spoke about worldview. 29 times in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon uses a phrase, and that phrase is under the sun. This means that Solomon is drawing all of his conclusions about all those things, wealth and wisdom, all of the pleasures, all of these things. He's drawing all of these examples as life here on earth, below that of the horizon, not thinking about God. So here's where he challenges our worldview, and he says, well, if you're just living to live, eat, drink, and enjoy yourself. But then he throws this curve to us in chapter 7. He says, but, oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you all, when you're living and your eyes are under the sun, they're just at the horizon, nothing thinking about heaven or God or a creator. He says, oh, and by the way, you're all going to die. This means that you're all going to have to face God in judgment. So remember, we're tying together some passages. We looked at chapter 3. We looked at chapter 5. We looked at chapter 7. Let's go all the way over to chapter 12. Our brother Bill had the great chapter, that close. And by the way, I think Bill went to the same barber I did. What do you think? But we do not go to the same gym. We do go to the gym, but they're two different gyms. But he forgave me for that, I think. Let's look at chapter 12. So again, I'm just trying to put some verses together. Chapter 3 told us, eat, drink, and enjoy your life. Chapter 5 told us about the same. Chapter 7 said, here's the curveball. While you're eating, drinking, you're going to die. Now we come down to chapter 12. We've already heard the conclusion of the whole matter, but I want to remind you of it again. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all, or this is the whole substance of man. If they were to take us apart and find out what our ingredients are, it should be fear and keeping commandments. That's what we need to be made up of. So, if our thinking is only below the sun, if our thinking is only from the horizon down, hey, Go ahead, enjoy life. Eat, drink, do what you're doing. But Solomon says, here's the curve, you're going to die. Then, chapter 12 reminds us that while you're going through all of this, and while you're just trying to enjoy your life, I'm going to get to it, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. I have to tell you this, that I have learned some profound lessons in life at funerals. One of the very first funerals, while I was still in preaching school, an older preacher, I just mean by experience, asked me to assist with him. And I thought, what a great experience to have someone there to help and to try and nurture you along. And I remember helping out with this funeral, and a man had lost his wife, a wife of many years. And here's the lesson I learned. We were in the funeral home, the service. We went to graveside, the service there. Everything kind of went on as scheduled. But after everyone cleared out and everyone went back to their cars, this elderly man, I believe he was about 89 years old at this time, he walked with 2 canes. His health had deteriorated to that point, and he had lost the love of his life. And here's where the lesson came. He sat by that graveside, and I watched him as he bent over that opening in the ground, and he wept, and he wept. I watched his very teardrops strike the top of that casket. We can learn from funerals. I really learned what real love was that day. I learned about a man who kissed the love of his life goodbye for the last time, who sat at a funeral service while some preacher tried to talk about how wonderful that person was, which, by the way, men, in case you haven't figured it out, we don't really know all of it. We're just trying to help the family at that point. There are some great and wonderful lessons that we can learn about death. But before we get there, Solomon says, fear God and keep his commandments. And he reminds us that if all we're going to be concerned about is the living, and our worldview is just, man, what can I get next? As was pointed out, as our brother had pointed out, of amassing wealth. I have not yet to this point, and now it's still early today, but I've not yet been in a funeral procession where the hearse had a trailer hitch. Have any of you ever seen the U-Haul behind it? Our entrance and exit in this world is the same. Naked we came into the world, naked we're leaving. Solomon talks about that of the futility of our lives even if we do amass wealth when we die and it's left to someone else. Even if we build the tallest building in Lawrence County, guess what? When we die, we can't take it with us. And he's bringing out and speaking to people, of course. Imagine being in the presence of Solomon and seeing a man who was speaking these proverbs and writing these songs, and he was building great things, and he had a navy, and he had trade, and he had all of this going on. To just be in his presence, you would be just, ah. And I'm sure no one stopped to say, does he fear God and keep his commandments? They saw this harem of women. Think of that, 1,000 women in your life. If you visited with each one for one day, it would take you 3 years to visit with each one. And they see all of this, and he should have been a great example, but instead he turned away from God and started building false temples to false gods for all of those women. So Solomon has reached out to those who had been admiring his wealth, his wisdom, his power, his influence, and he's finally telling them, I got it wrong. Go ahead and enjoy your lives. The things that you have are from God. Eat, drink, enjoy your lives. Eat, drink, and work. Enjoy all of this, but before you die, fear God and keep his commandments. As I was putting thoughts together, I want to just share this with you. Here, let me give you a summary of all that's talked about in death. And I was going to start with this, but I thought, I wouldn't even want to hear that just sitting down. But now since I've warmed you up, here's a summary of what Solomon says about death. First and foremost, that life is fleeting. It means it's just a few days in chapter 2 and chapter 6. And death is certain for all of us. Solomon reminds us all of us are going to die. Chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 6, whether we're sinners or whether we're righteous. And since God has appointed a time of each person's death, that's what he tells us in chapter 3 and verse 2. And by the way, if you don't want to read through those first verses in chapter 3, you can always get the birds with turn, turn. Yeah, they put it to music. That's what Ecclesiastes 3 is. Man cannot influence when death will occur, or even know when it will occur. Can you imagine the weight upon all of us if shortly after we were born, once we had the ability to understand, if we were given the knowledge that said to you, and I'll use examples from my own family, my grandfather died at 58 years old after an 11-year battle to that of emphysema. Can you imagine if that man would have been told, let's say at 2 years old, you're going to live 58 years and the last 11 years are going to be miserable in a VA hospital? Could you imagine the weight upon each one of us if we knew that? My own dad died at age 60 after a 1-year bout with brain and lung cancer. I can't imagine him. He was a shining light in my life, a smile, a laugh, and I could not imagine what that weight would have been like if each one of us would have an understanding. So, well, I only got 10 years left, then I'm going to die in a horrible car accident. Could you imagine the weight upon each one of us? So Solomon reminds us we can't influence it. We're not going to know when or even know how it will occur. He reminds us nothing can be taken from this life. In chapter 5, verse 15 to 16, he tells us the dead go to Sheol, which is translated as the grave, where the dead have no more opportunity to participate in this life's activities. Then it's this recurring message: death is final. Solomon actually says to be dead is preferable to be living, or a life of oppression anyway. And we're reminded that, and here's 4 quick points. I know all of my preacher buddies are like, 4 points, really? It's either 3, 5, or 7, and at least include a poem, right? That's the Fried Hardeman, 3 points in a poem. Let me give you 4 quick points. Why is it that we have difficulty with death? First and foremost is the fear of death. The psalmist spoke about it, is that of the terrors of death. Job spoke about it as the king of terrors. Hebrews chapter 2 speaks about that of death and how, in comparison with 1 Corinthians, of how death stalks us. We're afraid of it. That's why we don't talk about it. That's why we don't sit down and have a discussion about death. Why? We all fear it. The next point is that of forfeiture. Whatever we have gained in this world, whatever car, whatever computer, whatever home, whatever we've worked on, guess what? We can't take it with us. So we talked about fear. We've talked about forfeiture. The other point is the finality of death. You see, most of the problems we have with death is we only know this life. We live by experience. If someone comes and they said, I'm going to go explore a cave, we go and find someone else who went and explored the cave, and we say, tell me what it's like. And they tell us, but guess what? No one here said, hey, I died last week, and let me tell you about it. So we only know this life. The finality of death, when it's over, it's over. And the last point, the 4th point, I think this may be the one that really gets us. And Solomon speaks about this. And he talks about being forgotten. I don't think that's what each one of us woke up this morning and said, hey, I want to live a long life, and I want to do this and this and this, and then shortly after I die, I hope everyone forgets me. Let me close with these words. This was a supposed interview between God and a person, and I say supposed, but I think it summarizes what all of us have been trying to say today. This is an interview with God. Man asks the question, God, what surprises you most about human beings? And this would be the response, and here's how God would answer. That they get bored with childhood, and they rush to grow up, and then they long to be children again. That they lose their health to make money, and then they lose their money to restore their health. That by thinking anxiously about the future, they forget the present, such that they live in neither the present nor the future. The summary, they live as if they will never die, and they die as though they have never lived. Death is not a great subject, but it is definitely a reminder that Solomon gives us. As he talks about going through all of the struggles of life, yes, we all do fear it. Yes, as we talk about death, it's not only the fear, but we forfeit everything. We've worked our whole lives to build this, and now it's left for someone else. Will they care for it as much as we? Then he talks about the finality of death. It's over. Now, I do want to clear up one thing before we close out the lesson. In chapter 3, Solomon speaks about that man and animal are alike. And many have jumped on that passage and said, see? Now, here's the downside. You know, I've actually been called upon. A sister in Christ one time, many years back, called me and she said, will you do a funeral for my dog? Now, I love my sister, and I love animals, but I said no. And that was just my personal choice. But in those passages in chapter 3 of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon draws our attention that man and beast are alike, he is not saying that we don't have a soul and there's nothing there for us to take care of. He's just reminding us we're going to die and return back to that of the dust. Really, that's what he's talking about later in the book in Ecclesiastes 12. He says we're going to reverse the creation process. Remember, God took Adam from the dust and then breathed into him that of the gift of life. And in death, we see that the body returns back to the dust and the soul back to God who gave it. It's also an excellent passage to teach on why babies aren't born in sin. Let me give you this one. Growing up, the first 3 children, I'm one of 6 kids. First 3 kids in the family, red hair, brown eyes. Next one, dark hair, dark eyes. Then out pops Mike, blonde hair and blue eyes. All my brothers and sisters went, you're adopted, and I believed them. Here's the thing I'm trying to remind you of. Even though hair color and eye color I had to trace back in family to grandparents, there's one thing that we do know, as Solomon is talking about, that of our body returning back to the dust and our soul returning back to God who gave it. The soul I received didn't come from my parents. That means it doesn't have my parents' sin on it. I'm responsible for my own sin. I'm either going to perish in those sins or those sins will be forgiven, and I can look forward to that greatest place we've already spoke of. So I want to encourage you not to dwell on the shortness of life, not to dwell on, we're all going to die. That's all the preacher talked about for a half hour. Start living and start sharing the gospel. I love all of you, and I appreciate this opportunity.